what we're going to be going over here is variable and fixed overhead variance analysis. And first we'll set up our calculations here to determine these different variances, and then we're going to be laying out these variances on a graph here for both our variable and our fixed overheads. Okay, so when we're talking about variance analysis here, really what we're looking at here is we're trying to compare our actual results that we have for the period here versus some budgeted performance. And of course we're going to do that based on our variable and fixed overheads. So for our variance analysis, we're really going to have to first set up a static or a standard amount here that we have budgeted for those different overheads for the period. And then when our actual results come in for the period here, then we can determine a flexible amount here. And the flexible amount is going to be based on our actual results here and our static budgeted amounts. Okay, so first thing we have to do here to set up these different budgets or different amounts, we'll start with our static budgeted amount here. That's where we're going to take some budgeted quantity here, and of course we're looking at our variable and fixed overheads times some budgeted price for each of those. So budgeted quantity times some budgeted price is our static budgeted amount. Okay, so then when our actual results come in here for the period we're looking at, this is where we take the actual quantity here that we've used times their actual price. And that's going to equal our actual results. Okay, so now that we know our actual results for the period here and what we set up as our static amount or our standard amount, now we can determine the flexible budgeted amount here. And that's simply taking the actual quantity here that we've based on our actual results here for the period times the budgeted price, or based on our static budget. So actual quantity times some budgeted price here equals our flexible budgeted amounts. Okay, so now knowing those three different amounts here, or budgets, we can determine our overhead variance. And this is where we're going to be looking at our actual versus our flexible and our static amounts here. And then also you look at the overall variance between your static and your actual amounts. Okay, so what we're going to be doing here for these variable and fixed overhead, we're going to just for our calculations here, we're going to have some actual, and our variable and fixed overheads are going to be based on direct labor hours as our allocation base in this case. So you're going to have some actual hours here. For the actual amount, you're going to have some actual hours that you've used for the period here times some actual variable rate here on a per hour basis. So that's how this is going to, these are different different amounts are going to be determined. You're going to have some hours times some rate here, and that's going to be determine the variable overhead. Okay, so let's go on with our variable overhead here. We're going to be looking at both a spending variance and an efficiency variance. So first let's look at our spending variance, how we calculate that. Now I got everything color coded here so you can see how we're going to be doing our factoring of these different amounts or variables here in our formula here. So spending variance would start with our actual amount here, and that would be the actual hours used times some actual variable rate, and compare it to the flexible amount. That would be again the actual hours used times some budgeted variable rate here for our variable overhead. So the common factor here between our actual and our flexible amount here would be those actual hours used. So we can factor out our actual hours used. So the variance is really the difference between our actual variable rate here and our budgeted variable rate. That difference times our actual hours used is our spending variance here. So this is how we'll go through this table here to determine our different variances. So spending variance, again, actual variable rate here, compare that to the budgeted variable rate, that difference times the actual hours used. Okay, so for our efficiency variance, we're looking at our flexible versus our static amount here. So what we had for our flexible amount was those actual hours used from our actual amount here times the budgeted variable rate from our static budget. And then for our static amount, it's just going to be the budgeted hours allocated or allowed for our variable overhead for the period times some budgeted variable rate. Okay, so the common factor here that we can factor out between our flexible and our static amount is the budgeted variable rate. Okay, so the in this case, it's the efficiency variance that we're looking at, if I didn't mention that. So for our efficiency variance, we can factor out this budgeted variable rate here. That's common between our flexible and static amounts. So our efficiency variance is really the difference between the actual hours used and our budgeted hours allowed here. So that difference, actual hours used versus our budgeted hours allowed. That difference times the budgeted variable right here is our efficiency variance. Okay, so that's for variable overhead, spending variance and efficiency variance. Now for our fixed overhead, we'll look at our spending variance here first. So that's going to be our actual hours used times some actual fixed overhead right here. And we're going to be, for our spending variance, we're going to compare that to our actual versus our flexible amount. Now with our fixed overhead, it's a little different here for our flexible amount. We're going to be taking some denominator hours times some budgeted fixed rate here. So what we're talking about denominator hours, those are the total direct labor hours here that we have for the period here that we're basing both our fixed overhead and our spending variance, our fixed overhead and our variable overhead on, because they're based on direct labor hours as our allocation basis. Okay, so for our spending variance, again, going back to it's comparing our actual with our flexible amount, and then for our flexible amount we had those total denominator, total budgeted direct labor hours for the period times the budgeted fixed rate here. And we have no common factor here that we can factor out between our actual and flexible amount, so we just have to look at the difference. So spending variance with the actual hours used times the actual fixed rate here for our actual amount, and then we would subtract from that, or the variance would be the difference here. It would be the budget fixed rate here times the denominator hours. So the difference between those two here is our spending variance. And then for our volume variance, for our fixed overhead here would just be the difference between our flexible and our static amounts. And our flexible amount, remember, was those total denominator hours here for direct labor hours here times the budgeted fixed rate. And then for the static amount, it's just the budgeted hours allowed here for a fixed overhead times the budgeted fixed rate. So our volume variance is the difference between a flexible and static amount, and the common factor between the two is those budgeted fixed rate here. So our volume variance is going to be just the difference between those total denominator hours versus the budgeted hours allowed times that budgeted fixed rate. So volume variance, total denominator hours here, less our budgeted hours allocated here for our fixed overhead, that difference times the budgeted fixed rate. Okay, so those are our calculations. Now let's go down and let's look at it in graph form here. So what we do here based on our graph here, along our x-axis or our bottom axis, this is where we're going to have our direct labor hours here. That's our overhead allocation basis that we're using. So what we're going to have here, we're going to really be looking at three different amounts here. The budgeted hours allowed here, the actual hours used, and those total denominator hours here for our direct labor. And then along our y-axis here, we're going to calculate our overhead costs here. And then we've got two really lines that we have to deal with here. And the first one is this green line that's upward sloping here. And that's really our variable budgeted amounts here. And what we're going to have, I've got them combined here, but you can take, it would be the budgeted variable rate here plus the budgeted fixed rate here times some total direct labor hours here. You can look at them separately here, but the idea that I've got behind everything here is that if you didn't have, you could set up just one rate here for both the variable and fixed overheads here. You could just combine them into one rate here. If you didn't want to have, you didn't have to have a separate rate for both your variable and your fixed portions. But nonetheless, I'm just showing them here. So that's really the idea behind this graph that we'll be looking at. Okay, so we've got this upward sloping line here, and that's really those variable budgeted and fixed variable rates times those direct labor hours. And then the other line we have is this blue one here. That represents our constant fixed overhead rate. And that's the budgeted fixed times those denominator hours here. And that was for our flexible amount here. And we'll go up and we'll look at that later here. So we've got these. It's a little busy here, this graph, and can be a little bit confusing. But what we really want to look at is a number of different points on this graph. We're going to be looking at our budgeters hours allowed here based on our variable amounts here that we'll be looking at, and our actual hours used here. and also the denominator hours. And we're going to see where they intersect here on our different lines here. And we're going to be looking at the different variances and how these variances compare here. So let's first look at our budgeted hours allowed here, and let's look at how we'd make our calculations. So you move up from your budget hours allowed here for your direct labor. You hit your green line here, that variable amount that you have. This was the budgeted variable rate here, or budgeted fixed rate. We can combine them together times the direct labor hours. But nonetheless, you hit your green line, you move over here, and you're going to have a point here for your overhead costing here. So based on our budgeted hours allowed here, you're going to have some budgeted fixed rate times some budgeted hours allowed, and you're going to have some budgeted variable rate times some budgeted hours allowed. You can combine them into one rate, but that's the point that we're going to be looking at here. So all these, that's how this thing works here. We're going to be looking at these different amounts. So and then looking at our actual hours used here, let's just move it up to our green line here where it intersects our green line, the actual hours used. Then we're going to have some budgeted variable rate times the actual hours used based on our variable amount, our intersection here on our variable amount here. And then if we move up our actual hours used to our blue line here, that fixed amount, that's simply taking our budgeted fixed rate here, and it would be the budgeted fixed rate times those denominator hours. So that's the point here. Based on our actual hours used, we do have an intersection here. And then if we move up to the point here above both our blue line and our green line, this represents our actual cost here, because that, and really what we're looking at here is those actual variable rate and our actual fixed rate. They're different from the budgeted variable rate and the budgeted fixed rate. So we're going to move across here. Once we have that intersecting point here, move across to our y-axis here, and that really represented by the actual variable rate times some actual hours used, the actual fixed rate times some actual hours used. Okay, so you can see up here for our actual cost, it's based on our actual hours used here versus what we have here down in our budgeted area here was based on the budgeted fixed and budgeted variable rate based on the budgeted hours allowed here. Just to make those points. So we're working off our direct labor hours here on down in our direct labor hour allocation base, looking at our budgeted hours allowed versus our actual hours used. And then we also have the denominator hours. So let's just go and look at our different efficiencies here. And let's maybe just start with our total amount here. And we're going to relate it back to our chart here. So that was really the difference between those actual hours used here versus our actual variable and actual fixed rate. You can combine them into one here. And then that we would compare with our budgeted fixed rate and budgeted variable rate here times the budgeted hours allowed here. And let's just go up and let's look, that would be the total variance here. We can go up and look at it on our graph, but that's really the difference between our actual and our static amounts here. And we would do it for both the actual variable rate here and our budgeted variable rate, and they happen to be on the same point here, and our actual fixed rate here versus our actual budgeted fixed rate here. So that's our total variance. But let's go in here, let's start with our volume efficiency variance here. Let's look at that. And really this is the case here where we're looking at the difference between those budgeted hours allowed and the actual hours used, where they intersect on our green line here. And then we move over to our costing line here. That would be the budgeted fixed, budgeted variable rate times the actual hours used versus the budgeted variable rate times the budgeted hours used here. That would be our volume efficiency variance here. And we can go up and look at that here on our, let's do our comparison up here. So the volume efficiency variance was up here. It was on, the efficiency variance is only on our variable overhead amount. That was the showing here between our flexible and our static amounts. The actual hours used versus the budgeted hours allowed times the budgeted variable rate. See, the efficiency variance is only with our variable overhead rate here. it isn't included in our fixed overhead rate. So we have to calculate that, keep that separate. We can't really combine those between our fixed and variable overheads. But, okay, so that's our efficiency variance, variable overhead efficiency variance. Now let's look at our fixed overhead volume variance. And that's the difference between our blue line here, the point on our blue line, and our budgeted hours allowed here based on our budgeted fixed and variable rates here. That amount here. And really what we're looking at in this case would be the point here. There's budgeted hours allowed versus our intersection here. We're looking at the fixed overhead volume versus where it intersects our fixed amount here versus our variable amount. So that is what we're looking at here. You've got to move right over here. Those two amounts, that's based on our direct, those denominator hours versus our budgeted hours allowed. And you can see that here. The budgeted fixed rate here times those denominator hours versus our budgeted fixed rate here times the budgeted hours allowed. Those two different points here. And that was a fixed overhead volume variance. Let's go up and let's look at it up here on our chart here. So that's the difference between our flexible and our static amounts. And we factored out the common factor is those budgeted fixed rate here. And that's the volume variance. Now, to point out what we're talking about with the volume variance here, if you go up to your variable overhead, you're not going to have any volume variance. So you really can't combine those between our variable and our fixed overhead amounts here. Those have to be kept separate, so you can't really combine them. But what you can combine here would be this fixed overheads. We'll look at the fixed overhead spending variance and our variable overhead spending variance here. Those you could combine into one rate here between your fixed and if you establish this one rate here. We're looking at two different rates, but this is where you can establish this one rate. So looking at our fixed overhead spending variance, and that's the difference between what we have here. Our actual cost versus that budgeted direct cost here, a fixed cost here, between our fixed cost and our budgeted cost, actual cost here. So that would be taking our actual fixed cost times our actual hours used versus our budgeted fixed cost times those denominator hours. So that's our fixed overhead spending variance. And you can see that right up here. Difference between your actual versus your flexible amounts here for your spending variance. Okay, so that's the fixed overhead spending variance. Now our variable overhead spending variance, that's a little different. That's going to come off our actual costing line here versus our point that we intersect here on our variable amount line, or that increasing, or that green line here, our sloping line. And that's going to be the difference here between our budgeted variable rate times the actual hours used times our actual variable rate times the actual hours used here. That's our variable spending rate here, variable overhead spending rate, and you could see that here. That was the difference between the actual hours used here versus our, okay, let's look at that again here. That's that point and that point. It's all based on our actual hours used here, the variable spending rate. There's no, and let's go back and we'll look at the fixed, if I didn't go over the fixed overhead spending rate, but it's all based on the actual hours used here. It's just where they intersect these different lines, green line, the blue line, then our actual cost up here. That's why I'm saying here, where a fixed overhead spending and our variable overhead spending, we could combine that into one rate here because it's all based on our actual hours used versus our actual rate here. And a little bit confusing here, just to go back with our fixed overhead spending variance here, if we didn't make that case here, it's where actual hours used intersected with our fixed rate here, or our constant of fixed overhead cost here, and the difference between our actual cost here for our fixed overhead spending variance. And then our variable overhead spending difference was again based on our actual hours used, difference between where it intersected here with on our green sloping line versus our actual cost up here. So that's the point here when we're talking about looking at the different variances here. Now with the fixed and variable overhead spending variance, you can see we went through the difference there here. And those could probably be combined into one overhead rate if you had. But this fixed overhead volume variance and the variable overhead efficiency variance, they have to be kept separate between those two amounts. Okay, so I guess we went over our graph here just to understand it, and I could focus in here one more time just so you want to see what it is here where we're not relating back to our chart here, so we can focus in where it's large here. Okay, so what we've done here for our variable overhead efficiency variance, that was based on our budgeted hours allowed here versus our actual hours used, based on our green line here. We come across here, budgeted variable rate here versus the budgeted, looking at the different rates here based on our actual versus our budgeted hours here. And then for our spending variance, it was always based on our actual hours used here, looking at our green line, our blue line here, and then our actual costing line here. And then that was for our fixed spending variances here. And the fixed overhead volume variance, that was just the difference between our blue line here and our red line here, where they intersected here, and intersection here on our green line and our blue line. Then our fixed overhead spending variance was simply the difference between our blue line here and our actual cost here based on the actual hours used. And I believe I've gone through all of them here, but just focused in a little larger here to see understand these different variances. And then one last thing here. Let's just move over to our reference key here. You can see the AV here, actual variable overhead rate, AF, actual fixed overhead rate, BV here in red here was budgeted variable overhead rate, BF here was budgeted fixed overhead rate, AHU in green here is actual hours used, that was based on direct labor hours, BHA here is the budgeted hours allowed, and DH was those total budgeted direct labor hours, the denominator hours that we have for the period. And then all these rates here is just taking some total fixed cost here divided by those total direct labor hours that we're looking at here for these different rates. Okay, so that's a review here of our variable and fixed overheads.